In this true crime documentary, we uncover the twisted case of Nicole VanderHeyden.
Nicole VanderHeyden was 31 years old. She was living with her boyfriend, Doug Dietri, and they had just had a baby together.
She was an absolutely amazing person.
Heather Meyer and her family say it doesn't seem real.
Terrible. Absolutely terrible. She's been extremely up and down, numbing pain.
On May 21st, 2016, in the quiet farming village of Bellevue, Wisconsin, two teenage boys, Tommy and Jacob, were spending their Saturday helping Tommy's grandfather, Richard, with his alfalfa fields. The day had started out like any other in the countryside, nothing out of the ordinary, until something drew them away from the center of the fields, something they couldn't quite explain. Just before 2 p.m., they wandered toward the edge of the farmland near Hoffman Road. From a distance, they spotted something unusual tucked between the weeds. At first, they thought it might be a deer, or maybe a large animal resting in the shade. But as they moved closer, the illusion faded. What they saw stopped them cold. They turned and sprinted back across the field, yelling for Tommy's grandfather. Richard came quickly. One look was all it took. He picked up the phone and called for help.
Brown County 911, what is the address for your emergency?
We just found a human body laying in some weeds.
Okay, person beyond help, or do I need to give you instructions for CPR?
No, it's beyond help. It's starting to decay.
Is it a male or a female?
It's got long hair, but I didn't go near it.
When investigators from the Brown County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene, they were immediately taken aback by what they saw. Lying face down in the thick grass was a woman, her arms and hands positioned awkwardly above her head. At first glance, the visible signs told a story no one wanted to hear. She had fought back, her skin covered in bruises and open wounds. Faint linear marks circled her neck, like the trace of something tightly bound. But it wasn't until the medical report came in that the true scale of what she had endured became horrifyingly clear. Over 240 distinct injuries had been found on her body, including patterned imprints on her back, suggesting she had been stepped on. Other evidence confirmed she had suffered unspeakable abuse before her final moments. Yet no object was discovered nearby. The examiner concluded that the cause of her passing was a combination of severe blunt trauma and restriction to her airway. Before detectives could even process the brutality they'd just witnessed, their radios buzzed with a new call. A man named Doug Dietri was on the line reporting that his girlfriend, Nicole VanderHeyden, had gone missing. As Doug began to explain what had happened the night before, investigators started piecing together what now seemed undeniable. The physical description matched exactly. But more telling was the address Doug gave them. It was less than 3 miles from where they stood. From this point forward, the events would unravel into one of the most staggering cases, not only for the public, but for the investigators themselves. A case that would reinforce one truth: only the evidence can speak. And in this story, the evidence would scream to mark it as one of the most twisted cases in the country. Immediately after receiving the 911 call, an officer was dispatched to Doug's home. Doug explained that the night before, he and Nikki had gone out to a local bar in Green Bay called the Watering Hole. They were there with a group of friends for a live show by a band called Steel Panther. According to him, everything was going great, at least during the concert. But when the music stopped, things began to shift. The group they were with was larger than expected, and when the show wrapped up somewhere between 11 and 11:30, there was confusion about what to do next. Some of the group decided to head straight to another bar known as the Sardine Can. Doug, however, stayed behind at the original spot with his friend Greg to have a couple more drinks Nikki left with the others. The group split, and Doug claimed it was nothing more than a coincidence, just a small misunderstanding. But shortly after he and Greg finished their drinks, Doug's phone lit up. One message after another. Furious texts from Nikki. And furious doesn't even come close. She accused him repeatedly of cheating. She hinted that he had stayed behind to flirt with other women. She reminded him this wasn't the first time he'd disrespected her trust. Her words came fast and sharp like daggers through the screen. When the officer reviewing the texts read through Nikki's messages, she had questions.
Calling you abusive?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know where she gets this stuff sometimes.
Is that common for her to talk that way to you when she's been drinking?
Sometimes, yeah, I mean...
Or when she's sober?
She doesn't drink that often, but...
Okay.
All of a sudden she gets that in her head that that's what's going on.
Sure.
But more than the content, it was Doug's reaction that raised eyebrows. He claimed he didn't take the messages seriously. He brushed them off, blamed it on the drinks, said Nikki had too much that night, that she was overreacting, that there was no real reason for her to be upset. But was he unaware of how serious things were becoming? Or was this the first sign that something far deeper was unraveling? Doug continued recounting the night, saying that after a little while, he and Greg finally left the watering hole. They headed over to the sardine can, expecting to catch up with Nikki and the rest of the group. But when they got there, she was gone. He asked around and learned that Nikki had stormed out alone, still fuming after waiting for him longer than she felt she should have. Someone in the group said they tried to stop her, especially since it was late and she had clearly had too much to drink. But she snapped, said she didn't want company, just wanted to be left alone. Doug said he and Greg got into the car and drove around looking for her. He claimed he called her multiple times. At one point, she even answered. They talked for a few minutes, but according to him, her words were slurred and scattered. She refused to come back to the bar, refused to tell them where she was. After what he described as a frustrating search with no results, Doug said they gave up and headed home. Greg dropped him off. The babysitter was still there, but Nikki wasn't. Doug said he assumed she was on her way back, that nothing seemed alarming. So he checked on the baby, and by around 2:30 or 3 in the morning, he went to bed. That's where the initial conversation with Doug ended. How could he possibly go to sleep, knowing Nikki was still out there, drunk and alone? And why didn't he sound more concerned about a woman he claimed to love? The answers to those questions couldn't wait. They weren't the kind that could be left hanging overnight. So just hours after Nikki's body had been discovered, law enforcement returned to Doug's home. But this time, it wasn't for a casual chat. And it definitely wasn't just to follow up. They didn't ask him to come in. They brought him in. The first thing investigators needed to understand sounded simple, but it carried weight. Why did Doug wait so long to report Nikki missing? Sure, maybe he thought she'd come home while he slept. But what about the next morning? What was he doing all that time? Doug told them he had spent most of the day at home trying to shake off a hangover while caring for their infant son. He explained that the reason he didn't call police right away was because this wasn't the first time Nikki had stormed off after a drunken argument. Nothing bad had ever come of it before, so he assumed this time would be no different. He told himself she was just upset, that maybe she was crashing at a friend's place for the night. But as the hours passed, and he began reaching out to people close to her, he realized no one had heard from her. Not one person. And that's when he said, real worry started to set in. At that point, detectives decided it was time to stop circling around the truth. They told Doug what they had. The news had already hit the local channels by 10 p.m. A woman's body had been discovered in a Bellevue field. And now it was just a matter of time before either Doug or Nikki's family heard what everyone else already suspected.
Well, I think what we're looking at is this body that was found down the street. I don't think it's been 100% identified as her, but there's a lot of similarities.
What happened?
Well, I don't know.
That's what we're trying to figure out here.
That's what we don't know.
Is there anything else that you can think of that would be helpful to us in this?
I'm going to talk to everybody on that frickin' street and in that neighborhood. I need to do it.
They told him plainly. Based on the evidence so far, they strongly believed the body was Nikki's. Doug looked shattered when they told him. He said he was willing to do anything to help find the person responsible. He wanted justice. His emotions seemed real. And for a moment, investigators felt that maybe all their doubts, all their questions had been misplaced. Or at least that's how it felt in those few minutes. Because while they were still sitting with Doug, in the very same room, at that exact time, a message came through. A patrol unit had just reported something, and it was about to change everything. Not because it pointed to Doug as a suspect, but because it would speed up the entire search. And in that rush, new clues would surface. Clues that would bury the most unexpected twist. A twist pulled straight out of a movie, only this time, it was real. Roughly half a mile from the field, along a stretch of interstate, 172 officers found a disturbing trail of belongings. Clothes stained with blood, and several personal items were scattered by the side of the road near an entrance ramp. The clothes matched what Nikki had been wearing on the night of May 20th. And there was more. Her phone was there. So was her keychain. And dangling from that keychain was an ID badge from Green Bay School District. It was hers, no question anymore. Detectives now believed whoever had taken her life tried to get rid of her belongings by tossing them out of a moving car on the highway. All items were carefully collected, sealed, and sent off for testing. At the same time, the search for answers moved to 2 other locations. First was the sardine can, the last known place Nikki had been seen alive. Investigators hoped that by retrieving surveillance footage from the bar and the surrounding area, they might be able to retrace her steps and uncover what really happened during those final moments. The second location, Doug Dietri's home. When detectives reviewed the bar's surveillance footage, they confirmed it. Nikki had been there that night. She'd left the bar alone. Moments later, one of Doug's friends was seen following her outside, trying to convince her to wait, to just hold on until Doug arrived. But after a short attempt, the friend returned alone. That was the last recorded sighting of Nikki. Unfortunately, the area she walked into had no security cameras. It was a blind zone. Investigators were already planning to shift their focus to Doug's home. But just as they were about to leave the surveillance room, one of them caught something. On one of the cameras inside the bar, Doug appeared again. He was laughing, sitting with a friend like nothing was wrong. They rewound the footage, and that's when things began to unravel completely. Doug and his friend had spent maybe 10 minutes looking for Nikki, then returned to the bar and stayed there, which directly contradicted what Doug had told police earlier. He'd claimed he drove around for a long time looking for her, that he was worried and desperate to find her. But now that story was starting to collapse. Even after reviewing the footage from the bar, investigators were still trying to justify Doug's statements. After all, he'd been drinking heavily too, and maybe he couldn't remember exactly how long he searched for Nikki. That kind of confusion, it wasn't impossible. But if there was one place that could reveal the truth, whether Doug was genuinely lost in the chaos or lying from the very beginning, it was the home he and Nikki shared. When investigators first stepped inside the house, everything looked normal. They walked through the front door, and at a glance, nothing seemed out of place. But what they didn't know was that the moment they stepped into the garage, they'd be walking straight into one of the biggest twists they'd ever seen. It all started with faint bloodstains on the floor. But these weren't just stains. They were smears. The kind that suggested something had been dragged across the concrete. And those smears led directly to where Nikki's car had been parked. When they searched the vehicle, they found more blood inside. Back inside the house, they discovered traces of blood in one of the bathrooms. Not a large amount, but just enough to raise serious suspicion. Blood on tissues, blood on a sweatshirt, and then a pair of men's shoes. The soles had a wavy tread pattern, eerily similar to the marks found on Nikki's body. And on those soles, investigators found tiny red specks, possibly blood. With every new discovery, they were growing more certain. The man sitting in the station wasn't just a witness, he was the prime suspect. And this was turning into one of the fastest moving murder cases they'd ever worked. But just as things were closing in, someone unexpected approached the house. Doug and Nikki's neighbor. He had something to say, and it would confirm everything. He'd been out mowing the lawn when he spotted large bloodstains near the curb, and right beside them, a thin wire. It looked like a phone charger. That was enough for detectives to draw a chilling conclusion. This right here, just 120 feet from Doug's front door, was the primary crime scene. And that wire, it might be the murder weapon. All evidence was sent to the lab for testing, but at that moment, Doug was still free. He hadn't been formally charged yet. That changed the moment detectives started piecing together Nikki's final hours. They believed Doug came home from the bar in the early hours of May 21st, told the babysitter she could leave, and when Nikki returned shortly after a fight broke out, one that escalated and ended in tragedy. Doug, in a fit of rage, strangled her as she tried to escape. He then dragged her body into the garage, placed it in her own car. His was still at the bar, and drove 3 miles to dump her in an open field. Along the highway, he scattered her clothes and belongings, then returned home, cleaned the car, the bathroom, and himself. That's why blood was found in the garage, the car, and the bathroom. As for motive, there had been tension, fights, but detectives needed more. They spoke to the couple's friends, those who were out with them that night. All of them said Nikki was in high spirits. It had been nearly a year since she and Doug had gone out together since having the baby. She was happy. Doug, however, wasn't. Especially after drinking, he seemed distant, cold. One friend recalled being next to Nikki when she tried to call Doug after arriving at the sardine can bar. All her calls went to voicemail. But when the friend tried calling Doug from her own phone, it rang. That's when Nikki realized he was ignoring her, and she stormed out of the bar, furious. Suddenly, it all made sense. Doug wasn't the loving boyfriend. He was avoiding her, and all those messages Nikki sent that night, they weren't drunk ramblings. They were cries for help. Now, with witness statements backing the theory, investigators had just one thing left to be done.
Right now I'm going to be taking you into custody. I'll be handcuffing you. I'll explain all that to you in a bit, and transporting you down to the sheriff's department. Okay?
Okay.
Just be cooperative with me,
All right.
and we'll roll it that way.
Wow, okay.
All right. I'm going to get you down there, and we'll talk down there, and I'll kind of explain to you what's going on. I'm a decent guy.
Okay, I'm a decent guy too.
I get that. I'm sure you are.
After Doug was taken into custody, investigators began preparing the case files. To them, everything was nearly complete. All that was missing was the forensic lab results. But even without those, they were 99% certain that the evidence would only confirm what they already knew, especially after they searched Doug's phone and found damning messages. Texts to his mother. He told her he suddenly found himself tied down, a father, trapped in a life he didn't want, and that he planned to leave Nikki as soon as he sold the house. To the investigators, this wasn't just a theory anymore. It was the truth. They believed they had their killer, and that belief led to the official announcement.
Ledgeview man is charged with murdering his girlfriend. 34-year-old Douglas Dietri now facing first-degree intentional homicide for the death of Nicole VanderHeyden. You remember Nicole's body was found in a ditch Saturday. Investigators later found blood in the home the couple shared in Ledgeview.
Doug Dietri had been arrested as the prime suspect in the murder of Nicole VanderHeyden. The news exploded across local and national media. The story of a mother killed by the wealthy boyfriend who couldn't handle responsibility captured everyone's attention. People wanted to know more about the woman behind the headlines. Her name was Nicole VanderHeyden. She was 31 years old and lived in Wisconsin, a devoted mother of three, Michaela, Tyler, and Dylan. She had married her high school sweetheart, Brian, shortly after graduation. But over time, they grew apart and divorced amicably. Determined to provide a better future for her children, Nikki returned to school, earning a dual degree in science and education from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay in 2010. She worked as a substitute teacher in the public school system, specializing in science for elementary and middle school students, a job she loved deeply. Nikki was full of life, energetic, adventurous. She loved taking her kids on trips. She embraced motherhood with joy and built a happy life surrounded by family and friends. But everything changed in January 2015. That's when she met Doug Dietri at a bar. There was instant chemistry. They began dating quickly. Doug came from a wealthy family who owned a successful construction company. He was drawn to Nikki's warmth, her spontaneity. She encouraged him to live healthier, gifted him a Fitbit to help him track his progress. Just weeks into their relationship, Nikki discovered she was pregnant. They agreed to raise the child together. She and her two children, Michaela and Tyler, moved into Doug's home in Ledgeview, and in October 2015, their son Dylan was born. From the outside, it looked like a happy family, but inside cracks were starting to show. While the public was still reeling from the story of a mother murdered by her boyfriend, nearly 17 days after Doug Dietri's arrest, the forensic lab results finally came in. And they were nothing like anyone expected. The blood in Nikki's car. It didn't belong to her. It belonged to her daughter from an unrelated, non-criminal incident. The blood found in the bathroom, the tissues, the sweatshirt, that wasn't Nikki's either. It belonged to her sister, Heather, from a past nosebleed. The bloodstains in the garage? Yes, they were blood but not human. Turns out Doug was an avid hunter, and he'd recently gone turkey hunting a few weeks before. And the shoes? There wasn't any blood on them at all. When forensic techs compared the tread pattern to the marks on Nikki's body, they found the print was not enough for a solid match. But outside the house, the evidence still told a different story. The blood found on the sidewalk? That was Nikki's, and the thin wire nearby, what looked like a phone charger, carried Nikki's DNA along with a partial male profile. But that male profile didn't match Doug Dietri. In a single moment, the case collapsed. Everything investigators had built unraveled. Doug, while maybe distant or even emotionally detached, wasn't the killer. After 18 days in custody, Doug Dietri was released, and it was announced to the public the real killer was still out there. But this time, the investigation wouldn't start at the bar. Detectives were now certain Nikki did make it home. The challenge? No cameras had captured her route, and the male DNA found on the wire, it was too degraded to be submitted to CODIS. What once seemed like a solved case had suddenly turned cold. Or so they thought, because one piece of evidence was still being processed. Nikki's sock recovered near the body contained a clear DNA profile. When compared to the partial sample from the wire, it was a match. The full profile was submitted into CODIS. And the result? A new name? A name no one expected. George Stephen Birch. A name investigators had never heard before. He was 38 years old. And when they dug into his background, the story took a darker turn. George Birch had a long criminal record, mostly burglary and breaking and entering. But even more disturbing, this wasn't his first brush with a murder case. Back in 1998, he'd been charged in a fatal shooting, but was acquitted. Still, that detail wasn't easy to ignore. And neither was this before the murder. George had relocated to Wisconsin. He'd been staying with an old friend and his wife, Ed and Linda Jackson. Their home. It was less than a mile from the bar district where Nikki was last seen alive. But the real turning point came from a different case entirely. Not long after Nikki's murder, Green Bay police were investigating a hit and run involving a Chevy Blazer. The vehicle had been abandoned and partially burned. It was registered to Ed Jackson, but he had lent it to George at the time. When asked about it, George claimed the vehicle had been stolen. When investigators sat down with George, he voluntarily handed over his phone, including access to his Google GPS data, a digital breadcrumb trail of everywhere he'd been. When Brown County investigators reviewed that data, they were stunned. George's GPS history lined up perfectly with every critical location in Nikki's murder, from the sardine can, where he left around 2:30 a.m., to Ed and Linda's home, then straight to Doug and Nikki's house, where he remained outside for 40 to 50 minutes. From there, he drove to the field in Bellevue, the very spot where Nikki's body was later found. Then he drove down Highway 172, the same stretch where Nikki's clothes and belongings had been scattered. Finally, he returned to Ed and Linda's home just before 4:30 a.m. And there was more. George's internet history showed he'd been obsessively following Nikki's case. He searched dozens of local news stories. Investigators now had a new theory. In the early morning hours of May 21st, George Birch had either seen Nikki walking alone or had met her in another bar. He offered her a ride. She agreed, not knowing she was stepping into a nightmare. When he made unwanted advances and she rejected him, he snapped. He attacked her. As all this evidence came together, investigators placed George under surveillance. On September 7th, 2016, George Stephen Birch was arrested and charged with the murder of Nicole VanderHeyden. When the trial began in February 2018, Nikki's family faced one of the most emotionally exhausting chapters of their lives. For nearly 2 years, they had lived through confusion, heartbreak, and the wrongful suspicion aimed at her boyfriend. But just when they thought the truth was finally on the table, George Birch's defense attorneys dropped a bombshell. They turned the early suspicions against Doug into their own weapon. And George? He told a story no one saw coming. He claimed he met Nikki after she left the bar. According to him, they got into his car, decided to spend time together, and drove to her house. But when they saw the babysitter was still there, they parked nearby and stayed in the car. Then out of nowhere, he said he was struck on the head. When he regained consciousness, Doug Dietri was standing over him with a gun. Nikki's body was lying next to the car. George claimed Doug forced him, at gunpoint, to dispose of the body, drive off with her car, and scatter her belongings all to frame him. And the reason he didn't go to the police? Because he was on probation and didn't want to get involved. But no one bought that story. Not the jury, not the prosecution, not even the media. There was one simple question George couldn't answer. If Doug was the real killer, why was George's DNA the only profile on the murder weapon? And why wasn't there a single trace of Doug anywhere near it? His version also ignored the reality of Nikki's life. She was a nursing mother, highly unlikely to be out looking for a spontaneous encounter, and logistically, the story didn't add up. George stood at 6'7". The idea of an encounter in the backseat of a parked car outside Nikki's home at 3 a.m. didn't make sense. But the prosecution wasn't done. They had one final piece of evidence that would crush every last doubt. Doug's Fitbit, the very same device Nikki had gifted him. It recorded his movement during the night of the murder, and it showed just 12 to 18 steps between 3 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. That data aligned perfectly with his statement, that he had been asleep at home with their child. There was no way he could have committed the murder. The jury took only 4 hours to deliberate. George Birch was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Doug Dietri was officially cleared, but despite being legally exonerated, Doug's life never truly returned to normal. Just 9 months later, he was back in the headlines. This time, for something else. He was arrested for trapping Nikki's sister, Heather, inside his car, refusing to let her out after making unwanted advances. He drove recklessly, blew through red lights, and ignored her screams until she began kicking the window to escape. Doug faced formal charges and admitted partially to the incident. And while he wasn't Nikki's killer, his actions left a permanent stain. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime documentaries. See you in the next video.